and I am, together with Lupe, co-leading this, Lupe Gallegos, right at the back, co-leading this effort of the Environment, Latinos and the Environment Initiative. I want to thank you for being here. We know it's a rainy day, and the students are getting geared up for finals and midterms and papers, but we're happy that you're here. And before I move on, I want to thank David Montejano, Professor Montejano, who is here, who is supporting the, who is the director of the center, of course, and who is supporting this effort. Thank you, David. I want to also thank Professor Oscar Dubon, Vice Chancellor, for his support. And Oscar, I want to say thank you for, I know your time is very limited. Oscar used to meet with us on a regular basis before he became Vice Chancellor, but then he became Vice Chancellor, and he's busy, but we're glad that you're here. Thank you for your support. And I also want to thank the support of the College of Natural Resources, Dean Gillis, who's not here, but of course, the support of the college is important. And I also want to add that I'm glad that I see, I have to be honest, I didn't know there were so many Latinos in the College of Natural Resources. You guys are coming from out of the shadows, and I am glad that you are. No, it is true. You know, our college does. I'm not speaking ill of the college. I'm just saying we could do better in terms of the Latino African American presence in the student body. But I'm glad that you guys are here, and that those who are probably here. So I'm glad. So today we are starting the second seminar of the series that we began in September 16th, I think it was, right? So for that seminar we had a good turnout, and this time it's even better. And this is part of a series of events that we're having leading up to our, what we're calling Latinos and Environment Summit on April 5th and 6th. So make sure you put your calendars on notice, those who have very important stuff to do. I mentioned this because we have been working with a group of undergrad students who have been very supportive and working very hard. They're designing a website, they're helping us to set up a database for researchers. And so I know they're here. There is Telvin, there is Giselle, and there is Eva, who is visiting us from Mexico, by the way. Who else are missing? That's it. There is, yeah. So there's a couple more who are not here. One. Oh, Camila. Thank you. So they're working very hard, and so they came up with the idea that they will have a student-led event like this, where they will be here presenting their work, or a variation of this. And so that will take place in February. So we are already inviting you for this. We know undergrad students and graduate students have a lot to say about what they do, the research they do, the activities they engage. So we hopefully will have that in February as well. Today we have three speakers who I'm very happy to say we're thrilled to have them. I want to present first Guillermo. Thank you for coming, Guillermo. Guillermo is the California State Director of the Trust for Public Land. And Guillermo has a vast experience working in the public sector and the nonprofit sector. He's a member of several boards that deal with environmental justice, with and other topics, Chinese for Affirmative Action, Meals on Wheels in San Francisco, Brightline Defense Project, and hopefully you guys will ask him all kinds of questions about what he does more. I don't want to take too long on that, but I want to thank Guillermo for being here. In the panel, I know we will benefit from your thoughts and what you have to say.
Cal there.
Oh, not to mention, he is an alumni, a Calvert, from Econ and Sociology. And I will let him explain to you how that came about. But I also want to introduce Professor Jennifer Barros. She is a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and also associated with the Scripps Oceanography Institute. Jenny is here, and there's a little bit of story there. I met her through the Center for Planetary Health Centers of Expertise for Planetary Health, of which I am a co-deputy director, is where it is. And I'm doing research on the impact of heat waves on Latinos, on agricultural labor force, on health and the economic impacts of this phenomena. And Jenny, it so happens that she does work on this field, not necessarily on Latinos, but now she is. and she will be. And so we're thrilled to have her here because she provides a very good background in terms of the sort of quantitative and academic work and how that impacts Latinos in a very specific way. So without much ado, I want to let each of them introduce themselves for a few minutes, and then we go to questions and answers directly, because we're not having 25-minute PowerPoint presentations today. So Guillermo, please proceed.
Sure. It's great to be back on campus. I'm class of '91. I was sharing with the executive director of the Chicano Latino Alumni Association that it's amazing to see so many Latinos coming through the campus and being engaged. There were times where it was quite lonely, but it's really exciting that the alumni network is still up and running and engaged, and encourage all of you when you graduate to be quite active in that process. But my background, I am very lucky. I've done I've had three different experiences in my career. When I graduated from the campus, I went to work for a nonprofit called Latino Issues Forum. We were a statewide organization, advocacy, and think tank, if you will, based in San Francisco. And the goal there really was to try to engage in public debate in areas where Latinos had not traditionally been active in. So we were very active before regulatory bodies, very active in the legislature, very active in the private sector, really trying to get folks to be engaged. And the environment was always one of our big topic issues and one of our levels of engagement. We're one of the first organizations to go do an analysis of how many Latinos are on planning commissions, transportation commissions. We did this, in the 90s and into early 2000s, and the numbers are no better today than they were then. We still, have tremendous amount of folks that are not, engaged in substantive policy discussions around, environmental issues. And again, part of this panel, part of why you're interested and engaged, is there isn't a single issue in this state when we make up nearly 40% of the population that it isn't an important issue to us. From Latino Issues Forum, I moved on. I decided to go to the private sector and get a sense of what it was like to work there. I worked for a large utility company here in San Francisco, and was quite engaged from a private sector perspective. And then up until 2 months ago, I worked for local government. Thank you. And I worked in San Francisco for the city and county. I started under Mayor Newsom and then continued under Mayor Lee. And I was the director of policy and communications for the San Francisco Department of the Environment. And again, fully engaged on tremendous amount of major issues, trying to move them from a climate perspective, from a zero waste perspective within city government, and trying to move that forward. And again, it was relatively lonely. There was, there was only one Latino in that department other than me. And so, we've, continued to push and to diversify. And then recently I went back to the nonprofit sector and took on a job with the Trust for Public Land. For folks who may or may not know, it's a national environmental organization. It's probably in the top 20 of the largest environmental organizations in the United States. I'm managing the California operations. The Trust for Public Land does three simple things. It conserves open space. So we look to buy private property up and down the state of California that I'm responsible for, and put that private property back into public hands. So we go out and we'll buy property, we'll engage property owners, and then gift that back to either local government, county government, a regional body, state or federal. And so little things like The largest expansion of Yosemite National Park, for example, was an acquisition that the Trust for Public Land completed 2 years ago to add Ackerman Meadows, which was again in private hands to the people of this great country. The other thing that we do is we're park developers. One of the things that the organization realized is that a lot of folks in inner cities may not be able to get up to the Sierras. They may not be able to get out and access our regional and state parks or federal lands. And so really the idea is how do we begin to target communities and help them realize opportunities within their own neighborhoods. So we became park developers. And our focus on parks is in inner cities and poor communities. So all of our work is really in the most underserved neighborhoods that have multiple challenges from what we talked about earlier, asthma, economics, all the challenges and issues. And so that's what we're engaged in. We're park developers. It's really a cool and fascinating thing for folks in San Francisco. As an example, the 2 large parks that we've done there, one in the Tenderloin, again, probably one of the most diverse neighborhoods in San Francisco, and the other out in the Bayview, Hunters Point neighborhood, predominantly African-American, low income. And again, we're talking about 2 $20 million parks. We're also quite active in Los Angeles along the whole discussion of re-envisioning the LA River, of turning an asphalt river into something that is truly unique and engaging. And for us as park developers, we have a lot of landscape architects, and to them the best success of a project is when they see people using a park. So it's all about community engagement. And then the last thing that the Trust for Public Land does is policy. And so we're quite active working with local government. We're active with other nonprofits and advocacy groups around trying to get them the data they need in order to be more effective. So we're a highly data-driven organization and trying to get that data into the hands of activists who can use that to demand for better quality issues in their local communities, in their state, in their neighborhoods. And so we're actively engaged on that. So from my perspective, when I think of Latinos and the environment, it really is about getting engaged in those substantive issues that are critical to our community. And when you think about the environment, it intersects everything that we do, from our economy, our land use decisions, air quality, water quality, all levels of engagement. And we continuously need to get more and more folks engaged and interested and help demystify that the environment. There was a great article, and I really encourage you to look at it, the Sacramento Bee today. And it just goes to show what happens when you get a group of Latinos interested in a topic. And the article was about Latino legislators changing the debate around what environment is. So we have 5 Latino legislators that are currently in Germany, along with the governor of our state, at the climate talks. And they're all really, their line basically is that the environment isn't just for polar bears, it's for us as a community as well. And they're really redefining that. If you think about the leadership on policy that's coming out of the state of California, our Latino electeds in Sacramento have been at the forefront. The AB 32, watershed, decision, carried by a Latino, championed by a Latino. We have a park bond coming up on the June 8, 2018 ballot, led by Eddie Garcia down in the Coachella Valley. Another amazing leader doing some amazing things there. We have Assemblywoman Bonnie Garcia, who's been doing an absolutely amazing job around water quality and air quality issues in the Central Valley. And all that it took is getting a handful of Latinos engaged substantively in policy, and they're changing the debate. And so I challenge all of us to kind of, look at that leadership and be engaged. So.
Well, thank you, Guillermo. Thanks again for your intro. And just a quick note. You're not walking out of here until you tell us who the 5 legislatures were in Germany, so that we can invite them for the after.
Absolutely.
And so that's one thing. And of course, I think you point out to a very important issue, which is the issue of a lot of networking and Latinos getting together. I just want to mention something that we need to address also, which is if Latinos environmental welfare, whatever that might be, improves, society improves. So it's not really just about Latinos, it's about if Latinos improve, pretty much everybody gains, and that's something that we need to sell when we talk about the improvement or the relationship between Latinos and the environment. Because the moment we say Latinos and the environment, people go, "Ooh, that's kind of no white," or something like this. No, I mean, I'm just no. It is, but that's not the case. It really is about improving the lot of society, not just Latinos, right? If Latinos improve, everybody gains. So, Jenny, please.
All right.
So I'm glad to again introduce Jenny. Jenny's going to have a few slides, PowerPoint presentation. I will step aside, take myself so you don't use the text for kids. And so Jenny, take it.
I got you. All right, Federico said I had 5 minutes, so I'm actually going to be that person that sets an alarm for myself. Because academics are really bad for not sticking to time. So thank you so much, Federico, for inviting me. I'm super happy to come to Berkeley. I did not bring the rain with me though, because it's really sunny. It's really sunny in San Diego right now. I started as an assistant professor at UC San Diego in January, so I'm very new there. And I have this really neat joint appointment where I work on climate and atmospheric sciences at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which is shown in that picture. And I also work at the School of Medicine and Family Medicine and Public Health, and I look to join or look at the intersection between the impacts of extreme heat and air quality and radiation exposure on human health and well-being. And I often look at vulnerable populations in my work, and so that's dealing with children, it's dealing with outdoor workers, and the longer I've been in California, the more and more I learn about the outdoor workers in the Latinos population and how vulnerable they are to the extreme heat and how much we need to do in terms of data collection and the evidence base that we need to create policies on some of these issues. So I'll talk about that very briefly, and then I'll talk about a project we have actually on the Texas and Mexico border. So Federico told me to tell you guys where I came from, so I'm from Canada. I went to the University of Guelph. So I'm not from here. I went to the University of Guelph, which is really close to Toronto. I worked at Health Canada for my postdoc, and so I have a nice background in both atmospheric science and then applying a lot of the principles of atmospheric sciences to health and epidemiology. So looking at what is the risk of a heat wave on people's health in San Francisco, for example. I worked at Texas Tech for 3.5 years as an assistant professor there, and so my research focus has always been human biometeorology, looking at that influence of weather and atmosphere on people and vulnerable populations. And so now I do a lot of in situ work, meaning I go to the site, I collect measurements, whether it be on a football field and looking at the vulnerabilities of people in those environments and how we design it, down to the person level and doing core temperature, skin temperature measurements, and then also different measurements on kids. So we're working to develop more sensors and small low-cost sensor technology so that we can start collecting physiological data to combine with some of this neat weather information. But to give you an idea of some of the work I do in the area of Latinos population, so outdoor workers in California are extremely vulnerable to extreme heat. And in the map I'm showing here, these are all deaths due to heat and outdoor workers. And I did mention before, this is extremely underreported in the US. So these values from 2008 to 2014 don't represent the number of deaths that actually occur. We know there's a lot of hidden data that's not reported in a lot of the migrant worker populations, especially along the border. But you can see California that really sticks out as an area where workers are dying due to heat exposure in the fields. And that's not okay. Not one death due to heat is okay. And I don't care where or who it is. There's some up in Minnesota. Still, that's a really big deal for us to understand who, where, what, and why happened there. And so this map actually was created by Michael Weiner, sitting right here. At the bottom there, looking at the temperatures in California and where some of the biggest vulnerabilities would exist along the Central Valley region there, and then also down in Imperial. And so we're looking to do a lot of projects that take actions to understand these vulnerabilities now and then in the future, with future climate change. What's going to happen? How can we prepare economically? How is our economy and the productivity of the workers also impacted by this? How does the current health and well-being of workers impact their ability to do their job? One thing that a professor at UC Davis recently discovered was the horrible increase in diabetes in a lot of these workers. And then another faculty member who studies in Canada said, well, people who have diabetes have a really hard time with the heat, and their core temperatures can't get up near as high in the heat when they're working. But I don't think these two professors have talked yet, but I think they need to talk, because there's something there in the vulnerability of low-income workers in the fields in California, and we know a lot of them are migrant workers living in substandard housing, and how we can protect them from getting diabetes in the first place that also puts them at an increased risk. So that's one example of one vulnerability, and there's so many more. You're not going home to air conditioning, you're going home to a hot house. You're drinking pop, you're not drinking water, you're not getting what you need on the fields, and we don't know enough about what the employers are doing to protect their workers. It's not documented very well, and so I think there's a lot of work that can be done there. So what I'm looking at with the workers is, what is that overall environment? How much are they gaining through convection and losing through evaporation, and gaining through radiation? And so it's not just air temperature that's going to cause someone to go into heat stress. So that's where a lot of my work goes. And finally, I did bring some reports. We have a project on the El Paso-Juarez border where we're looking at heat resilience in this border location. And so we did a big workshop there. We have both Spanish and English versions in the one packet, so feel free, I threw those on the back table, to grab one. But there's a lot going on with outreach, community engagement, building awareness. But what's really interesting about this region is that it's along that U.S. Or Texas-Mexico border there, there's a lot of colonias. So who's heard of colonias? A lot of people, right. Colonias, unincorporated areas, substandard housing, houses don't have water, don't have power, don't have roads, but people, there's over 3,000 colonias in this country, most of them in Texas. And promotores are the community health workers that are the connection to keeping those folks in the colonias safe. They're communicating with them about health and well-being, but one thing they don't have much training in is extreme heat and how to deal with it. So we're creating training for the promotores and the community health workers, as well as the midwives and the doulas that actually go to the houses and work with the pregnant women, because there's a big issue that we're starting to see in the data with preterm births and heat stress. And too much heat during specific periods of the pregnancy that's causing preterm birth. So we're going to start collecting data in the houses as well, and the doulas and the midwives are helping us with that. So we've been doing a lot there with prevention and heat safety and training of how can you make your house passively cooled when you don't have the ability to even get air conditioning. And there are things that can be done that we can learn from even hotter countries like Bangladesh and China on what they're doing there, so that we can protect people in this region. So those are just a few of the things that are going on, and so I wanted to give you an idea of that. But they actually created this really neat video, and they created May as a heat awareness week, and so they have these videos in Spanish and in English that they're sharing across the region there on 10 ways that hot days can make you sick, but 10 ways to stay safe. So that's just a couple examples. And a lot of this might be common sense, but for some people, you have to be prepared to be able to drink water because you have to go get it miles away. And this is in the USA. So I think it's important to be aware of this. And it's something I wasn't aware of until someone brought the idea to my attention. So,
all right.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Jenny. We'll have questions in a second. So now, I'm privileged. Where is Esperanza? Esperanza made it. Hey. So I'm glad that I can introduce Esperanza to the panel finally. Esperanza is with the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. Restore the Delta. You're a member of the board, I understand. Yes, and I will not take too much time, but she has a long curriculum when it comes down to to environmental issues and community organization, community participation. She happens to be a Cal alumna as well, right? Spanish and Chicano studies. Right. Okay, perfect. So, Esperanza, we're doing a 5-minute or whatever amount of time you think to introduce yourself, the work you do, the people you work with, and then we will start taking questions from the audience. So, welcome. You can do it from there or from... Yeah.
I guess I could.
Or you can do it from here or whatever makes you good. Yes. Okay.
Okay, gracias and buenas noches, buenas tardes. My name is Esperanza Bielma, and yes, I'm an alumni from UC Berkeley. I'm part of the Chicano Latino alumni class of 1991. And I'm from the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, and that's the reason I was late, because I was coming from a convening in Merced for EJCW. So I just made it right before there's something happened on the 5 and the interchange there in Stockton. Originally from Stockton, California, and basically in terms of, like the title that we have here with the Latinos and the environment, that component is basically void, you know, as far as California, like what I've seen in my interactions and the activism that we've done at the local level and at the statewide level. I returned back to Stockton about 5 years ago, and I started a cooperative for startup companies and nonprofits and freelancers and artists. And as a result, I met the executive director of Restore the Delta. I was familiar with the Delta and its waterways, but didn't know the importance and significance as it plays the role for the state of California. So lately, I have worked on a campaign to stop the tunnels, and as the environmental justice director for Restore the Delta. So in that, they've also put into place a leadership program for the region of the Delta. And for the inaugural class, which I was a part of, there was only 2 of us, another woman of color and myself. So then the next class, we nominated some other folks because we were supposed to represent the 5-county region of the San Francisco Bay Delta. And so with that in mind, within that class component, I think that's when I actually realized we had rallies and different participation, advocacy days at the Capitol, what have you. But it wasn't until I was in the class, and there was 20 of us that were part of the inaugural class of what the composition was. There were elected officials that were part of the class. But then it wasn't until the director of the Delta Stewardship Council was presenting, and I asked if they had anything equivalent like the Air District has an environmental justice advisory group or committee, and they said no, but we hired someone, you know, so I guess that's supposed to, you know, take care of all the environmental justice communities for the state of California. And so then that's when and the fact is that I had gone that was about 2 years ago, and I had gone to make a presentation on the levee strategy with the Delta Stewardship Council, and so he remembered me. So the fact that he remembered me was like a little scary, because I think I looked a little different than most of the folks that present. So I think that you know, I kind of wanted to speak to the challenge that we face as activists, environmentalists, is in terms of integrating that at the university level, but then at the advocacy level, so that we have representation of environmental justice communities, so things like that don't happen, and what's taking place like in the border town. And you don't have to go that far, because there were cities in the valley that didn't have clean drinking water because of the way that everything is set up as far as like farming, corporate farming and what have you, corporate ag. And so that's really what the fight is about, right? Because it has to do with those that have and those that have not. And so the environmental justice communities are the ones that always suffer. I mean, the fact that there is a task force through the Cal EPA that's set up to go to those communities in which water and air and land come together, and those that are most toxic, then that's where they go and reach out to and assist. But what are we doing to prevent that? and what are we doing to inform our environmental justice communities. So what we're trying to do, before Restore the Delta, they didn't have an environmental justice component. So there's farmers on the board, there's different folks that are on the board there, but they didn't have an environmental justice component. That voice has now been heard because Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, that executive director is an attorney by trade, so then they made the presentation to the State Water Resource Board to include the legal component for the phase 1 of at the State Water Resource Board. And so then that's why we're now a part of phase 2 of the legal proceedings of that. And there were communities, disadvantaged communities, that are able to speak out on behalf of their communities through the notice of intent and the legal proceedings. Now moving forward, that's where we're at with regards to the tunnels. But I think that we have to find out what role we can play at a local level, whether it's at the university and or our communities, to inform ourselves of what's taking place, and then those that are informed and have the opportunity to study, like the environmental sciences, and then moving forward, how do you play the role of whom you are in your communities. And because, for example, like I mentioned the Air District and ARB, they have an environmental justice component, an advisory group. I'm a part of that for the Valley, and it took us like a couple of years just to be able to access the board directly, because they find out we're some kind of, crazy group on the side. And so the fact is that the water folks don't have that at all. So that all of the people are just making decisions for all of Californians at the water district level. There's representatives there that are sometimes appointed or they're elected, but are they representing the environmental justice communities? And so then there's a lot of money that's involved with that. There's many years of taxes that will go into play to pay for like big infrastructure. And so we're talking about like, $60 billion like just for a project. They don't have enough money to build both tunnels, so then they want to do one tunnel, and you have to do a whole nother EIR and what have you. But what about the environmental justice report? Where does that come into play? Where do the voices of the environmental justice communities come into play? And so we've been asking ourselves that question, and so as a result, we formed, in doing this whole advocacy work, we started working with some women in the Los Angeles area, and they were dealing with toxins in Paramount. So they were dealing with toxins in Paramount, and then they have a whole another group, Compton Moms. So we hooked up with them, and then we did a training on water, and so then they just got blown away, and so they're like really pissed off, and they're Latinas, and so they were starting going to all the Metropolitan Water District meetings. So now we formed an alliance, and we're going to form a group that'll be at the local but the statewide level as well, in terms of the representation of the environmental justice community where it's missing. And in this case, it's with water, because of the fact that they understand that on the air component, there is an environmental justice piece to it. There is not when it comes to water. There are groups like EJCW and others that do the advocacy and get the monies to help get the information out, but that's not enough. We're talking about having that component at the local level and at the statewide level, but then not just that one committee is getting, because we talked about, people talk about getting elected officials into place, but we also need to get people in those like commissions and appointments so that that voice can be heard for the environmental justice communities. So the issues that are happening in San Diego or in the Valley are known and widespread, and not just some little side note that's in the LA Times or in Forbes magazine when they're talking about Stuart Resnick. So that's where we're at right now. That's what I'm working on currently. Is I'm still environmental justice director of Restore the Delta, and with EJCW as board member, as a vice chair, and then but we're working on now is incorporating that component and then layering it, because that's not complicated enough. We're going to layer it with technology, and And so we have some mujeres that are versed in that arena. So then how is it that you can take and implement ideas of with new technology to like the old ways of doing things, so that way you can have access to clean drinking water, and then create that. I mean, that is a basic necessity in terms of like of water and then air. So applying those technologies, but really encouraging women to be a part of that in terms of like making those technological applications. So that's what the organization, the new one that we're working on forming, and when that comes into play, then I definitely will let you all know.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you. All right, we are, like I said, we're really looking forward to the questions that you might have for them. I'm going to ask one question to each of them, and then if you guys don't have more questions, I will ask the second question, but I'm sure you have plenty. I just wanted to ask, and one of the things that Latinos and the Environment does is that we care about asthma rates in certain parts of Los Angeles, because we know that asthma happens more at a larger rate in certain parts of Los Angeles than others. In fact, we're doing some research in Mexico City. Where is that? And in Mexico City, it's the same story, right? In terms of the impacts of environmental variables on individuals' health and well-being. We know that income matters, education matters, and so on and so forth. But the question that I will have for example, a person like Guillermo and Esperanza is, and then for Jenny to kind of elaborate on that as well, is what is your past experience with the academic world and gaining information from them that helps you to do whatever it is that you do, and how does Jenny sees her role in generating, for example, you and I are working or planning to work together on issues, kind of metrics and measuring things that will serve as input as to others to make decisions. And I mention this because Latino and Environment is precisely that, right? So to foster the relationship between different stakeholders, in this case, community-based organizations, NGOs, in academics, to have a more informed decision-making process, I think. And that would be one of the things that we would like to foster. So how do you guys, I don't know who wants to go first, how do you see engaging yourself with the academic community? Because remember, in the academic community, the bread and butter is to publish. It sounds ugly, but that's the way it is. You publish papers, you write books, you write chapter books. We were talking about this earlier, right? And the stress and the funding and the whole thing. And that seems to be sometimes distant from NGOs and so on and so forth. So how do you would like to engage that?
I'll jump in just with a couple of things. I think the role for academia and nonprofits is critical. Without Jenny's work and others like that, we don't have the ammunition, if you will, to be effective at what we do. And where I do think that greater collaboration needs to happen is more conversations between what NGOs, what groups are doing, what they're trying to accomplish, and talking to faculty. Because without that conversation, faculty may not know what to focus their issues and attention on. So for me, here's a great example. The work that Jenny's doing on the heat studies and analysis, and I look at what our organization is doing. We're working on a project that we're launching in Oakland, and it's a pilot to go track 5 schools. These schools are all in low-income neighborhoods. If you go out and look at them all, the entire playground for all these elementary schools are all blacktops. And the heat analysis will tell you that on a hot day, these kids are out there, and the challenge that they have is just that you can't play. So the Oakland School District has a rule that if it's a certain degrees outside that they can't run, they can't do things. And so how do you begin to deal with all these issues? And so we're going to go up there, right? And the whole idea is to turn those laptops into much more impervious pavements. Let's do back to the connection on the water issues, on storm drain, stormwater management. There's so many ways you can begin to plug connections, but I think it's that conversation that needs to happen between the academy and advocates on the ground who are doing amazing things, because we need that data, that engagement, because that's the ability that we have to go out and convince, a local water board, a school district, empower parents and communities with information. And so it's helping translate that academic material into meaningful policy changes, as well as, education and outreach.
Thank you, Guillermo. I don't know, you want to add to that?
The only thing I would add to that, I mean, what Guillermo broke down is like perfect example of like in terms of working together and then moving forward and having like a project, what you're talking about with regarding the playground area. I would add that in terms of like having, because of you said funding is an issue, right? So in terms of academia, so because you need the statistics, you need the analysis, and you need the experts, but then if you combine that like with private entities that are doing the work, because they do have the funding and they're able to do like more advanced work. So finding a way to integrate that, the academics with the private component, will then help the nonprofit organizations and the communities. So there is a way, because for example, we did, this is going to be our third year. We have a hackathon in Stockton, H2O hackathon. And so the first year that we did it, we're going to do professionals, but nobody, as crazy as it may sound, did not want to go to Stockton. And so, so then we moved down and we have high school students, but it's because the high school students beat out the professional engineers. We gave them a platform through IBM Bluemix, and so the kids beat out the engineers, which they weren't too happy about, but that's what ended up happening. So then there was a firm there that's over in Los Angeles, and those are the women that really saw the students being able to compete with the engineers, and then that put that together. And so, but their firm, for example, I was just thinking of that when you were talking, is that they work on all of those components where they do the rainwater capture, working together with like porous type of materials and what have, like all environmental. So like, they do stuff for like cities like Los Angeles and what have you, but they can then, with the academic component, whatever research is taking place with that, like couple that together to make a stronger argument for those type of projects and communities.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know, I know you want his phone number because you so, but other than that, what else do you do?
It's very exciting to me. I didn't really talk about my playground research, but if you ask me what I've been doing research on in the last 3 or 4 years, it's understanding the influence of designing playgrounds on children's health. And so a project that I've been working on in San Diego County, and similar to here, you have, you're protected a lot from the heat when you're in the ocean, and as you go into the county, you hit the desert. And so in El Cajon in San Diego County, it's a poorer population. In the playgrounds I'm working in and collecting data, there's a high Latino population and other different groups, but it's in a lot of the lower income areas, and as you mentioned, there is a huge lack of vegetation, and so when we look at the impacts of extreme heat on these areas, we see higher rates of mortality and higher rates of heat illness, and one of the ways to adapt to that and for climate adaptation is putting in vegetation, is putting in greenery, and it is thinking about how you can design for that space based on the local climate, so that in the future it's more protected as well, just now and in the future. And so children are a huge vulnerable population that I also focus on. And so I actually just submitted a proposal for a project to do a, kind of what you're saying, a naturalized intervention in spaces like that. And as I'm writing the proposal, a really important part of it to think about is what are the needs of those people and how can I integrate those needs in the proposal now, not after. And so, like you said, we need to be working together at the start of a project, at the infancy of the idea, and then as you develop the idea together, because the way we don't want to do it is me to go off and do this research and come to you 4 years from now and say, hey, look what I made, how do you like it? And then you're like, well, we can't use that because that's not the way we communicate this. That's not the data we needed to create this policy. So I want to know, what data do you want to have to create policies? So for example, I'm collecting how much UV exposure do the kids get in this environment versus this environment? What is the influence of that tree on their burn potential and hence skin cancer rates in the future? And to me, that kind of connecting environment with health is what's needed for policy change.
Yep.
And that's my goal there. And so that's why I really want to talk to you, but that's a really good example of it. And so what else, what do talking to workers in the field, talking to the employers, what do we need to know from the employers that make it really hard for them to implement these adaptation policies for their workers? What's the cost of it, and how limiting is that cost, and how much more costly could this be in 30 years from now when it's way worse? And how is that going to impact the economy in California? So a lot of these questions, but I think that working together from the start, and also teaching our students science communication. So all you guys in class right now, you're learning probably great science and great policy and all that. How do you communicate these really complex ideas to a policy maker? We write tons of climate reports. Michael just had one come out. And what's read from those climate reports from policymakers is essentially a one-pager saying this is the takeaway. And how do you turn 150 pages of scientific data where 5 years of work went into, how do you turn that into one sentence? How do you do that? It's very tough, but it's figuring out what kind of data is needed to create policy. And if you don't get that evidence base, then it's really hard to make change, because then you have nothing to go from. People don't want to spend money on a maybe impact. They want to spend money on an impact that is going to occur.
Thank you, Jenny. I just want to point out that this issue here, this hookup here, that was planned all along. 6 months ago, this was already on the books. They don't know it. So no, thank you very much. I think that this is a very good example. I also want to point out to the funding issue here. We in academia, when we get funded for computers, lab salaries, GSIs. You know, some of us push very hard for undergrad students. Some of those have worked for projects that I'm engaged in. We have to put them there, and sometimes they go, really, undergrad students? Okay. But, you know, that's just the way it is. But very seldom you're allowed to put a budget line to include a budget line for community engagement or community. You know, one time I went to a very small city in the Central Valley, and this person we know said, you know what, I want to do a study on this and that. And he says, oh man, that's great, the mayor, right? We're talking about the mayor. He said, oh man, that's great. You think some of that could be left here in the community? And somebody will interpret that comment as a aggressive, you know, whatever. He was asking to actually hire people from the community in the project and to buy equipment that could be left at the community, computers or whatever it is that could end up benefiting. You know, he did not mean to say a priority, but if anybody in the academic world hears something like this, they get the wrong idea. I mean, I think, and that's something that we really have to try to push, to engage the communities, but the communities to benefit as well, you know, through jobs, through projects, and whatever it is. That's why I would just say on that.
I wanted to build on that. So the project I talked about that's along the Mexico-Texas border, the foundation that funded that, one of the stipulations was that half of our funding has to go to the community. So if you can find foundations, they're much more willing to be more flexible with their budgets than somewhere like the NIH would be. And about $30,000 is going directly into the pockets of community members, the promotoras, the doulas, the midwives, the community members we're working with, that they're going to get the training and then also pass along the training. That's really good. And then the other thing is, with the proposal I just submitted last week to the National Institutes of Health, which is a federal funding agency, they would fund, some of the money would go to the daycares I would be working with, and a lot of the money would go to the whole redesign of these playgrounds. Because without that, and that's a direct benefit to those schools, to those areas. But without that funding, I can't do the study. So I don't know if I'm going to get it or not, but they do really love the idea. And so there are ways you can try and get around it. Often it's very tough to just say you're going to directly pay someone. Right. But there's ways around it. But Federico's right, a lot of the times we're budgeting for, of course we want grad students and computers, but there's always rules. But the foundations, I would say, a lot of foundations are stepping up in these areas. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Hari Foundation, and there's so many that don't have so many restrictions on how you use your funding. And they're good spots to work with community members with, just figuring out what they want.
So I wonder if anybody from the audience might have a question. please.
Well, first of all, thank you for your for your explanation. My question is regarding how can you make something just like Latinos and the environment, which sometimes, well, for example, nowadays environment is being taken out of the agenda. How can you make it relevant? How can you like put it into politics and economy so that it's being moved?
Well, the way that we did it was on the legal end. So, for example, because of the fact that with the State Water Resource Board, the folks that were considered legal water users, they didn't consider environmental justice communities to be legal water users. So even though they lived in the cities that were part of the legal proceedings and in the communities, or they were part of the organizations that were legal water users, and they didn't, like, in essence, own land the way the farmers do, the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water said that because we are legal water users, and we have access to clean drinking water and recreation, but clean drinking water was like the main takeaway from that. So that's like at a state level in terms of that argument. But then I think that even being involved at the local level and knowing what's going on, just in essence, like a lot of people don't even go to those water district meetings unless there's something going on. And so they're not used to seeing a lot of people. You know, they would make decisions when I started going to the Metropolitan Water District. They would make decisions in like 15 minutes because if it was like opening day, you know, for the Dodgers to play, they're like, oh, you know, we got that covered, it's $15 million, boom, 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 let's go, you know? And so there was like no public comment. There was like 2 of us there, and I'm from Northern California, you know, I'm making public comment in Southern California. So I think that being aware and involved just at the local level even, and finding out what is taking place, because the decisions that are made affect you, your communities, for like years and generations to come. Because if they assess the monies through, like, for example, property tax, and so sometimes there's you can make the argument, some of the arguments that we're going to be making on the legal side is, like, for example, the representation of the folks on the board is based on their property tax. So the higher income property tax folk have more representation. And so then, but that's not something that's publicized, you know, that you have to read in the documents and what have you. But organizations like ours have that information. So you can easily just go to an organization and find out an advocacy group at the local level and find out what is taking place and what's coming up as far as events that will affect policies that will affect you, whether it's air or water that you're interested in, because they make decisions at that level, at that local level. And then at the statewide level, then that's when you get into the legal component. But the involvement is just even being there. Just being there and then asking those questions, because there aren't folks that go to those meetings at the, you know, in terms of at all the various meetings throughout the state.
Do we have any communities like Flint, Michigan? In California?
Yeah, there's some things that are going to be taking place that are some of the studies that they've done with the environmental impact report that are similar to that situation. And so then they're working on with some of the organizers from Flint, Michigan, both EJCW is, and some of the organizations from Los Angeles. So they're going to be coming forth with that information, because they're the different studies and what have you that were done with the chromium-6. And then because basically they've said that it's not in the water, even though they found it in the land and in the air. So, but there are some situations like that, and that's going to be coming out like this next year, and so be looking out for that. Yeah.
All right. Yes.
Could
you tell us what your name is?
I'm Jessie.
Jessie, thank you.
A question for Guillermo particularly, or anyone else who can address this. I'm from a city in the Midwest, and we have a university, we have NGOs, we have community members who are interested in environmental issues, but they're interested in energy and like waste. So I was wondering, how do you recenter that conversation?
Just to, staying on the heat and schoolyards, and a lot of it is just, it's not necessarily fighting what the interest is. but expanding the definition of energy, expanding the definition of waste, and finding opportunities to connect. So for example, the work that we're doing in Oakland on the schoolyard projects of taking the blacktops off and creating green schools, we didn't lead by schools need to be green. We led that whole discussion with the school district around stormwater treatment and how we can address their financial issues and maintenance issues and all of this. So the schoolyard, the health issues for the kids, the green space, greening, all this, which is our core work that we enjoy. We didn't lead with that. We led with stormwater management issues and the challenges that Oakland has in managing its stormwater so that it doesn't end up in the bay. So a lot of it is really taking what the interest is and then trying to find within that conversation opportunities to change to still achieve what your ultimate interest is, but to do it through their lens. And you can still achieve that. And then as you go through the process, they begin to have ahas and realize, oh, yes, the health impacts of kids in our schools is really important. We want to elevate that higher. Oh, yes, we need to have much more greenery in our schools and engagement, and we need to do better planning, and school design than we've done before. So it really is just an approach, and that's something that works, and is one way to think about how to expand, environmental issues in areas that may have a particular, interest in one area. My thought.
So I also want to add that, for example, in the particular case of Latinos in the environment, the approach that we're doing here is one where somebody asked me, well, I said, well, it's multidisciplinary. I say, and the way you look at an individual, we don't look only at we need to make sure that we look at a household, a Latino household, or a male or female individual in a very inclusive way, where if we're dealing with an issue associated with water, for example, water pollution, contaminants, certain particular chemicals in the water, we not only look at that variable, but we need to look at why is it that the chemical is there in the first place, what is about the piping that allows for this thing to be there, and so on and so forth. So so you do it in a more integral way, I guess I would say, in a more inclusive way, holistic. I don't want to use the word holistic really, but in a more comprehensive way, I guess I would say. Then it is easier to change the conversation than if you just kind of concentrate on energy per se, or something like this. Professor?
So one thing that really strikes me that I appreciate much more is that, and I think a lot about sort of who's sitting here and what our roles are. And especially at Berkeley, we want to be advocates, we want to be activists, but then we're trying to be scholars, right? And so trying to balance that. And this idea of, I see advocacy and looking at policy and policy changes in that advocacy framework, and then I see the university saying, well, we need to be obtaining knowledge, which is allegedly unbiased, right? But that's how we think about it, and how important it is to know that we need to be asking the questions to address the knowledge that we need to have. So coming up with that question and then just letting the knowledge take us where we go, and answering that question smartly with the lens of advocacy, but really understanding how they complement each other and they're not the same, and how we can be scholars in searching for knowledge but asking the right questions. And oftentimes, as I've heard from you, people are not at the table to ask the right questions. And in terms of advocacy and in terms of knowledge search, and how we can do that together better, I think goes back to that original question about how can we do that better, that we ask the right question to develop that knowledge that then is informed by advocacy while not being the same. And I thought that was very interesting.
Some questions? Any more questions? Mr. Winner?
So I'm going to ask the hard questions. Don't take it personally. For you, I suppose. So my work has been on climate change. Thinking more, long distance, future distance in the future. Because you were involved in the Delta, I think you understand how complex the issues are, both in terms of environmental justice, but all the other vested interests that are involved. These problems are more or less here and now. I mean, they want to build this right away, or within the relatively near future. As climate change continues to warm us, we have some really serious problems ahead of us involving water. In particular, the Sierra snowpack will essentially be gone by the end of the century, with a disruption to the California's agricultural economy that could cause a collapse. But these kinds of problems, lots of them, seem so distant to most people. How do you frame these kinds of decisions that need to be made now, when the payoffs is in the next generation? We have some thoughts about that.
Well, basically what we've been doing as far as that, how that plays out with the Delta, because of the fact that when they talk about like California agriculture, and you're talking about in the building of the tunnels, is to obtain the freshwater flow as it comes into the Delta and divert it for corporate agribusiness, because of the fact that right now, as it stands with the Delta water that's diverted to the southern region, so Kern County specifically, and Westlands Water District. So then, for example, so in that case, you're talking about like the snowpack that we have has been diminished. So they're not going to receive any, so the argument that we would have is you're not going to get any more water where there's no more water to get, right? And so then, and if you divert the freshwater flow, because right now they're still getting the water, and we're not arguing that people shouldn't receive the water, but the residents only receive 30% of the water in Los Angeles. 70% goes to corporate ag, and it's unsustainable corporate ag, because what's planted in the Westlands Water District and Kern County that want the water, want the fresh water, is almonds, pistachios, pomegranates, and they also own Fiji water. But that's all unsustainable ag in that area. So prior to that, when they had the oil fields that were there, that's what some of the water that they're using for the cuties and the halos, that's what they're irrigating with. And so Food and Water Watch has a component on that. But so in terms of that, that's just gonna, so our argument would be it's just going to make things worse if you're diverting fresh water flow that's supposed to come down and flush out the Delta system, and then that affects everything, the people, the fish, San Francisco Bay, and so it just deteriorates things at a larger scale and much faster and further, because of the fact that you won't have the fresh water flow. Because the water's still being pumped out, but it's being pumped out after it goes through the Delta. And so what they want to do is take the water before it reaches the Delta, and so then it would just so the whole ecosystem would be damaged. So then, but the corporate ag would still get their water. So right now they still get it regardless. So I think that's also why, like Westlands Water District, they voted no on the funding, because they know they're going to still get the water regardless. They just wanted the freshwater flow and the tunnels to be built, and they'll be and then it's to go underneath the Delta. And so they're 40 feet in diameter, and then they would go underneath.
My guess is that these tunnels, even if they were built and were to serve the purposes they were designed for, would probably not be particularly useful when there is no snowpack.
Exactly.
You need water for them to work.
Well, the water comes through, it just all comes through in March instead of August.
Yeah, and then there's like a cartoon that from, I think it's the San Francisco Chronicle, where it's like the governor's there, and it says turn on the water with the tunnels, and there's like one little drop of water coming out of these like two massive tunnels, and they're on. So it's kind of like.
So I wanted to try to attempt to answer that question, just your broader question, and in the following way. Because again, as advocates, we're always constantly trying to figure out best ways to communicate. And when you think about climate change, and you think about, the Paris Accord and the agreement, I can't go to my mother and tell her that what we really need to do is get to 2 tons per capita of GHG reduction is how we're going to save the world. And she's going to look at me and say, what the hell are you talking about? Or, we need to, all the scientists say we have to be, no more than 2 degrees Celsius in terms of to be able to manage, overall global warming. None of that gets communicated in ways to the public, the voters in particular, that need to be informed. And it really is about translating, again, the work that academia is doing in ways that nonprofits can use it to be effective, that we can translate those things into more movable pieces. So, I would never bring, an academic to a town hall meeting to try to move my, issue forward. I would absolutely bring that person, an academic, with me when I'm sitting down with a smaller group, and a legislator or so forth to support things. But I think a lot of it is how we communicate. One of the examples in San Francisco, before I joined Trust for Public Land, we have a huge, audacious goal too in our climate action strategy in San Francisco. We want to get, 80 by 50 is what everyone's talking about. 80% greenhouse gas reductions by 2050. And how do we do that? We don't even have the conversation around what that means because again, the public, what is a greenhouse gas? What does it look like? It's not tangible. How do you measure that? And so the strategy that San Francisco laid out was something very simple, so that everyone can feel that they can participate. Because the challenge with a lot of the research and the data and the communication is that it's dire, it's imminent, but yet it's still 100 years away. It's still something that's not in my lifetime. And so the strategy we had was just simple, 0, 50, 100 was our climate action strategy that we talked about to the public. 0 waste. And everyone can contribute to that. 50% of all trips in sustainable transportation, meaning get out of a single-use car, use public transit, walk, bike. If you're going to drive, should be an electric vehicle, and engagement. And 100% renewable energy. Very simple things to grasp for folks to be able to make decisions. But all the backdrop associated with that, there are huge studies, there's huge engagement, there's multiple layers of plans. But it was just that simple way to communicate to somebody, what can I do on climate change? Very simple in San Francisco. Separate out your waste so that we're recycling and we're capturing organic materials so that we can turn that into compost. It's about your individual decisions about how you commute to work or commute to your friend's house, and it's ultimately the decision that you have on your bill to go with 100% renewable energy. And so it's a marketing thing, but it's important to begin to think about how we communicate these complex, scary things in ways that, and I always use my mother, she's my test case, if she doesn't understand it, then there's no way that I'm going to be able to be an effective leader in getting government to do the right thing. And so it's thinking about that kind of marketing.
I know you participated on a project, or you just wrote something about translating science into, right?
Oh, I just took my kids, or not my kids, my class yesterday to an aquarium to teach them, or for them to learn how really complex research projects by professors at UC San Diego were being turned into displays for the public to understand what was going on. So that's what I was telling Federico about today. But I heard another speaker last week, and a really nice quote is that this isn't a future problem, this is a now problem. And this isn't a polar bear problem. I think you mentioned polar bears before. It's not a polar bear problem, it's a where you are problem. And so making it resonate with whoever you're talking to. And so have people been dying of extreme heat as long as we can remember and have data for? Yes. Could that be exacerbated in the future, and is it likely to? Yes. Who's going to suffer the most? The low-income populations that don't have the coping capacity. All of these things we know now, and if we have a heat wave tomorrow, that will be what happens tomorrow, not 30 years, 50 years, 100 years from now. So it's not a future problem, it's already a now problem, and there's a lot we can do about it now to make it better, and whatever we do now will still make it better in the future. So if we know that the average temperature of San Francisco is going to rise 2 degrees Celsius in the future, what can we do with our knowledge that we already have for heat mitigation in cities to cool it off 2 degrees Celsius? Because there's a lot we can do. It doesn't mean we're going to decrease the temperature of the world 2 degrees Celsius, but it means we're going to make the locations that people live and work safer. And I think that's huge. And we have the knowledge to do that, and technology is going to play a huge role in how we adapt to climate change. Whether it's extreme heat, whether it's air quality. And I mean, a lot of kids deal with asthma now, and so it's a problem now. And so thinking about who are you going to go talk to, and what example of the impacts of climate change now will resonate with that person. And so if the farmer, the way you talk to a farmer is going to be different than someone living in the inner city with a kid with asthma, than someone who's living in the north of Canada dealing with melting permafrost, or someone who's living on the coast dealing with sea level rise already. So thinking about who you're talking to, that's a really nice way to think about science communication.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, thank you. Yes, we have time for a couple more questions, I think. I don't want to keep you guys here. And yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I feel like
I forgot your name, sorry.
Oh, my name's Adam.
Adam, thank you. All right.
Hearing two narratives about how to solve environmental problems that we've mentioned amongst the panels. One is from more of an environmental sustainability or mitigation approach, where people in colonias are trained so that they can cope with extreme heat. So that individuals are trained to know how they can reduce waste kind of individually. And the other is an environmental justice approach, which kind of asks why we have corporate agriculture in the first place that's allowed to utilize devalued labor in order to maintain their profits, right? The question I have that I'd like folks to reflect on is these two narratives often work at odds with each other, I think. And in the case that a more progressive corporate agriculture company can say, well, now we have new uniforms for our farm laborers, and now we've mitigated according to the measures, and so now we've solved the problem, right? And the system can continue. At what point do you have to be strategic and not be able to not ask those questions in order to kind of achieve more policy objectives? And at what point is it absolutely crucial to ask those questions about more transformative or justice concerns?
Well, that's a deep question. Thank you for that. Okay. Anybody wants to take a crack at that?
Well, I actually lived through some of those questions that you asked because they will, like you said, in terms of responsible corporate practices, so especially like with the Valley, and we were talking about like if they are the ones that in terms of on the pollution side of things with the air, and then in terms of the water, because they're the ones that are needing the most water in an unsustainable agricultural setting. And but then they'll be the first ones that have, because they have the funds, so they'll have, you know, everything, electric vehicles and everything else, and you know, in terms of sustainable ag and everything else that's going on. But then the folks that are left out of that equation, like you said, are the environmental justice communities, because they are still the workers, and they're still the ones that are not receiving the drinking water. They're like getting the water imported because it's the halos, the cuties, the almonds, and everything else that's getting the water. And that's not to feed America, right? Because 70% of that gets exported to China. So the thing is that it's difficult in the sense that because that's who we're basically up against, and then that, you know, that because I'm also part of the PM 2.5 for the air district in the Valley. So then they'll go and speak to that, and they'll say in public, well, this is what we're doing all this sustainable ag. So, but nonetheless, it's on a large scale. They're not a small farmer. It's a corporation. So it's going to continue to create the situation that's there in the Valley that affects the rest of the state in terms of like water and air. So but you're talking about a lot of money that's involved in terms of those corporations. So I think that there's some effect that we can do, but it still has to be on the advocacy part of it as well. We need both groups to work, and we work hand in hand with, like we work with the Center for Biological Diversity, we work with the various scientists, so we do bring them to those public meetings and then training the community and then making them aware of what is taking place there with them so that they can become advocates for themselves and then for their communities, because that's still important is in terms of trying to make that change so that it could be done at both levels. So I still go back to that because that's what needs to take place, because it's not taking place right now. Like, we don't have that because people aren't informed. Like I said, when we did the training at different communities throughout Los Angeles, they weren't aware of how even the organizations functioned and how they obtained their funding and how that affected their lives. So how the corporate agribusiness from the south end of the valley was really affecting a resident in the city of Paramount. You know, how is that going to affect them and their children? So making those connections through education, through training, and through advocacy, I think is one of the ways that we can kind of hit upon that. And then I made the mistake when I was talking about the cattle, I said like dairy instead of like cattle, because there's more cattle farms, right? And so then that's because of the consumption. But then what is it that they affect the air quality tremendously? And so then I said like dairy instead of cattle. This guy went ballistic, you know, because he was like the dairy advocate, you know. So, but nonetheless, they're all cows. So I think that still we need to be able to do that at that local level, and then that way, and inform the community and continue to do those trainings alongside with the university, because I think working together will make it even more powerful, so that people, the communities know what's taking place and they understand.
It could very well be that the university will serve as a unifier of these two views. It could very well be that we could be catalysts for them to work together, I think, or for these two visions to not to be sort of like which it happens, by the way, it's certainly true. So I don't know if you guys want to. No. Okay, and what's your name?
Mauricio.
Mauricio, where are you from?
Oakland.
Not yet, but any organization in particular?
Oh, I'm just a regular guy from Oakland.
Okay, right. Go ahead. No, we want to know who. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess my question's around more in terms of the development aspect. I know you have, NOLA being rebuilt, you have Brooklyn with a different concept of resiliency when it comes to real estate building out. So my question is both on the urban side. What are some learning lessons in terms of the advocacy of the new builds? Because look, Cal just built and is building a crap load of buildings around here. Simultaneously, right, how do you connect that type of development and construction build out cost to even 20 minutes away where it's Contra Costa County and it's pretty rural, there's still farms there. So I guess my question is how do you embed those types of elements of development work? Because the biggest concern, in addition to the human impact of just climate change, is the resiliency of San Francisco being underwater, Cal being underwater, and other places that are going to be real. So how do you see that from an advocacy perspective to really highlight that? Because we're still building right now. We're building apartments, we're building housing for students, and we're building in a way that we know that we're not going to be here in 100 years, so who the hell cares, right? So I guess my question is when we see this stuff in the cranes, what is the appropriate conversation piece to have?
Anybody wants to take a last? Yes, Guillermo, you are working on Oakland.
No. But there are trade-offs with everything, right? And I speak to San Francisco as a model only because I worked there for a while. For the new built environment, thinking about our climate challenges and how we're going to hit our goals of greenhouse gas reductions, and a lot of it we began to look at our building code, look at our water code, look at all of our infrastructure, and so had important debates around requiring all new, so for example, in San Francisco, if you build any structure, it has to be LEED certified gold minimum, all new construction, but there comes a cost with that. All new buildings in San Francisco, for example, have to mitigate nearly 100% of all their stormwater that is attributed to the building. The building has to meet higher water efficiency standards than anywhere else in the state. We've elected as a local community to adopt these added regulations on ourselves. So the buildings in San Francisco, different than in other parts of the state, we've elected to do that. The trade-off is it's more expensive to build. And then you have the residual effects that how do you deal with affordability in a place like San Francisco? But we just can't get captured in the debate to say that, well, let's stop doing these things that are good for the environment, good for water, good for air quality, good for all these things so that we can address affordability. There are so many other mechanisms and ways to not have that conversation go down that rabbit hole. But I think, again, the state as a whole needs to adopt these kinds of policies when we think about, how we build and where we're building towards. And again, you have a debate in, that affordable housing in California is non-existent. It's engaging. You have advocates out there that are saying it's because we have to do environmental impact reports. It's because we have all of these regulations that we have to build buildings to certain standards. And if we get rid of those standards, if we get rid of environmental impact reports, we can create more housing, and it's going to be much more affordable. And that's a bunch of bullshit. They've never been able to do that anywhere else, and they're not building those types of products in California. And so it really is this this challenge. We need to raise the bar when we think about our built environment, and require higher levels of efficiency, require higher levels of building design. We need to get our architects to think very much more creatively than just pure aesthetics, but about building efficiency and design. It's ridiculous that in a place like the Bay Area, these tall buildings, you can't open a window, it's all recirculated air. So again, it's all of these things to think about and to engage, but not to let it be driven against the other important issues around affordability, around the need for more housing, and those are the challenges and the debates that need to happen.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Very quick stab at that one. Great question. I think I have 2 points after thinking about this. Well, California is leading the way on a lot of the climate adaptation policies that can be put in place so that we can continue to live here in the long term. And the other thing, I think that coming at it from an academic perspective and seeing, the publications that come out, but then the media pieces that are written on those publications, they don't always line up. And the media likes to sensationalize things and unfortunately use a lot of scare tactics, which I don't personally think is the right way to go. The media should be reporting all the results from the study, which is impossible to do, but by all the results I mean saying the range. So I think that's the first I've heard that this area could be underwater in the future, but I'll have to look into that. I'm not from this area, I don't study sea level rise in this area, but I would say that when we think about the projections going forward, we've got all these different scenarios that the world could take, and there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And I like to be able to put that into terms by saying, if we do follow the high emissions pathway, which maybe is what, if we followed that, we could be underwater here. Okay, but what if we followed the medium or low pathway? What is the potential there? And that's where mitigation comes into play. So we can mitigate this much greenhouse gas, and then it'll result in this much less sea level rise, for example. And conveying that message of this is the power that we have now to make that change is important. And so it's not that doom and gloom, we're all gonna have to move. Some people already are having to move due to climate change, but it's a lot of the things being put in place right now can deal with some sea level rise. Yesterday I was at a talk and I heard that they're thinking about floating airports. in San Diego because of sea level rise, which is crazy with
Aircraft carriers, right?
yeah, right. So there are, like I said, technology and infrastructure are two main ways that as a society will be using to adapt to climate change. And so I think it's just important to look at the range of potential futures and not just focus on the worst or the best, but what's in between and how do we get from really bad to a bit better. Because conveying it's either you never ever drive again versus we all die to the public is a really bad way to go about it. The other thing is engineers are still using, or maybe it's changed in the last couple of years, but textbooks from 50 years ago, and using climate data from 50 years ago that aren't using future projections. If we build a bridge that needs to last for 50 or to 100 years, we can't use climate data from 50 years ago. We have to be using climate data into the future. So I do know one scientist that's funded by the National Science Foundation to be putting these climate change projections of this increase in temperature means we need to be using this type of material for our roads in, let's say, Virginia, right? And so the roads don't buckle, or the train tracks don't buckle under the heat, because that happened in Australia a few years ago. It got up to 50 degrees Celsius and the train tracks started buckling. And so how do we get our engineers being trained today to start using climate data in their designs in the future? And so that was the second point I wanted to make. And I think that it starts with the people teaching right now and the people learning right now to be asking these really great questions. So thank you.
All right. And with that somewhat positive note,
Hopefully.
we want to thank you for being here, guys. I want to say that, for example, this is our second seminar. There are issues that we have not even started to scratch the surface of. Latino farmers in the Central Valley, Latino farmers in Imperial Valley, Latino farmers in the urban context, for example, Latinos and education in the environmental field, Latinos and green jobs and environmental, and so on and so forth. So hopefully we'll have much more of those in the future. I want to thank you for being here, and again I want to thank the panelists for their time, their valuable time. I want to thank you for your valuable time, and thank you for being here. All right. We will have our event on February, and then we have, put it on your calendars, the 5th and the 6th of April for a big event on Latinos and the environment. And we'll have breakout sessions and all kinds of good stuff. All right, thank you.